The last 3 voyages of Columbus. On his second voyage to America, Columbus was given a fleet of 1,000 men. When they arrived back in Hispaniola, they hoped to find the Spaniards they had left behind on their first voyage. But instead, they found them brutally killed by the natives. They then set out to build a permanent settlement on Hispaniola, but this was harder than expected. It was hard work with little progress. And then sickness spread among Columbus's men, and on top of this the natives attacked. The revolt was eventually put down and the captured enemies were sent back to Spain as slaves, marking the beginning of the Atlantic slave trade. When Columbus was away on exploration, those in charge of the settlement misused their power, inflicting heavy punishments on both their own people and also the natives. Eventually, Columbus, in desperate need of money, forced the natives to pay tribute in gold, which they had to find through hard labor. During the third voyage, Columbus finally found mainland South America, although he still believed it to be Asia, and there they found evidence of more sophisticated civilizations, and they even found a mummy. But then, a Spanish inspector came over and found Columbus's colony in complete disarray, for which Columbus was brought back to Spain in chains. And on his last voyage, Columbus's ship, which was by that time infested with worms and filled up with water, ran aground on Jamaica, where they were stranded for an entire year before they were finally rescued. So, we have a lot to get to. Let's start. Hey, good to see you. This is Stephan, author of In Search of the Sublime. On this World History channel, we'll trace humanity's relentless pursuit of scientific truth, moral excellence, and enlightenment. We'll meet anyone from Mesopotamian astronomers and Indian yogis to Greek philosophers and Enlightenment scientists. And you'll meet them firsthand using primary sources, giving you valuable insights that transcend the surface-level understanding you get on other channels. Go check it out for yourself. Let's start. After a successful first voyage, Columbus quickly gained approval for a second voyage, and this time with a much larger fleet consisting of 17 ships and over 1,000 men, and this time including soldiers. The prime goal of the voyage, however, was not conquest, but to convert the natives to Christianity, for which they brought Friar Bernardo Buil. The sovereigns, the king and queen of Spain, did demand that the natives were, quote, treated very well and lovingly, and the Spaniards were not allowed to steal from them, but only trade, and those who maltreated them were to be punished. Other objectives were to establish a trading colony, and also to further explore Cuba to see, quote, whether it was an island or the mainland, which Columbus hadn't yet figured out, and the final objective was to look for gold. When the fleet reached America, they went ashore on a Caribbean island, where Columbus's first encounter with the natives, with the Taino people, had been very friendly. This island was inhabited by violent cannibals known as the Caribs, who were known to often assault and abduct the friendly Taino. Entering a hut on the island, they were shocked to find human flesh, and also young castrated Taino captives, who were being fattened up for their meat, and also captive Taino girls, who were kept to produce babies, who would then also serve as food for the Caribs. Abhorred by these practices, and in an attempt to defend the Taino, Columbus and his men captured some of the Caribs that they found, and after having caught them red-handed, they now declared them the enemy. Columbus also let one of his crew members keep a, quote, very beautiful Carib girl, naked according to their custom, as a slave. And here we see the beginnings of colonial slavery in the Americas. We read that when she refused sex, she was beaten until she acted as though she was, quote, brought up in a school of harlots, something Columbus himself never partook in, but he did allow this to happen. When the Spaniards finally returned to Hispaniola, the island they had settled on during the first voyage, they discovered that the 40 Spaniards who had stayed behind on the island had all been killed, and their fort was burned to the ground. And they soon learned that a rival Taino leader, called Coanabo, was to blame. Columbus then tried to find a suitable spot for a new settlement, which they named Isabella, after the Spanish queen. But due to persistent winds, they were forced to settle at a second-rate spot. Only later on would they pick a more suitable spot, which they named Santo Domingo, which became the first permanent European settlement in the Americas. In the meantime, sickness had spread widely among his crew in Isabella, and combined with the hard labor to establish this settlement under less than ideal conditions, the majority of the settlers became discontented and wanted to go home, which created a very unstable situation. The crew also moved inland, where they constructed Fort Santo Tomas, which then became a base camp from which to mine gold, which had been found in the first voyage in this location. But then Caonabo, the rival Taino leader, attacked the fort. Columbus then sent 70 men for its defense under the leadership of Alonso de Ojeda, and this turned out to be a very bad call, as Ojeda was not as kind and forgiving as Columbus. When he heard that Spaniards at the fort had been robbed of their clothing by the natives, he cut off an ear of a Taino man and also sent a local leader in chains to Isabella. And according to Columbus's biographer Las Casas, these were, quote, the first beginnings of the shedding of blood. Columbus then left with a small crew to further explore what he still thought to be the Indies, or Asia, while he put his brother Don Diego in charge of Isabella. And this was another huge mistake, as Don Diego just didn't have the leadership qualities to cope with the unruly colony. While Columbus had ordered that no harm was to be done to the natives, Ojeda also kept handing out savage punishments, and the commander of the fort, called Pedro de Margarit, also extorted gold from the natives, raped their women, and also took their boys as slaves. So things were definitely spiraling out of control at this point. Meanwhile, Columbus had reached Cuba again, and now explored enough of its coast to realize that it was an island, and therefore not mainland Asia as he had hoped. Interestingly, on the island, his men saw men in white tunics in the woods, whom Columbus interpreted as subjects of a mysterious character called Prester John, who was a mythical Christian king who, according to medieval legend, was believed to reside in India. A very interesting tale. Columbus then discovered Jamaica, where his ship Niña shipwrecked, and then Columbus returned to Hispaniola, and to his shock he discovered that the natives were ambushing his men. To restore order, he took 1,500 natives captive and brought them to Isabella. And with only a small amount of gold to show for, he then decided to send all these captives back to Spain as slaves, which was against the wishes of the sovereigns, but Columbus was running out of money. To further finance his expedition, Columbus also decided to have the natives pay tribute in gold. We read that they had to work so hard to reach their target that many natives fled, or they killed Christians out of retaliation, after which whole villages were punished. And we also read that many Taino took cassava poison to end their lives. Meanwhile, Friar Buil had left for Spain when Columbus was gone, and then complained that Columbus was mismanaging his colony. In response, 5 ships commanded by Juan Aguado were set to investigate these claims. When Aguado arrived, he found a colony where almost everyone was sick and discontented, while those who were healthy were looting and catching slaves. Not at all a pretty sight, and not much later Columbus returned to Spain. On his third voyage in 1498, Columbus decided to sail further south as he approached America. When he arrived, he first landed on the island of Trinidad, and afterwards he had the first sight of the mainland, although at the time he still believed that he had found yet another island. Ojeda would later call this land Venezuela, or Little Venice, as the natives who lived there often lived in dwellings on poles. Once there, Columbus was soon surrounded by, quote, an infinite number of canoes, and with the natives there he drank icha, a fermented drink made of maize. And he also spotted some natives wearing golden discs around their necks. These natives, Columbus noticed, were clearly more sophisticated than both the Taino and the Caribs, as evidenced for instance by their advanced cotton clothing and also their skilled metallurgy. And another sign of higher culture was the appearance of big freighting canoes, who had a cabin amidship. Moving on along the coast, Columbus eventually found an enormous amount of fresh water, streaming from 4 rivers into the ocean. What he had found were the mouths of the Orinoco River. And correctly, he assumed that this amount of fresh water could only come from the mainland. So finally, he thought, he had reached mainland Asia. In his diary, we read that Columbus was so impressed by Venezuela that he believed that he had found paradise. And he was strengthened in this belief, since the Bible mentions Eden, the Garden of Eden, as both a place in the east, and it also had 4 rivers. So you can imagine he must have been very excited. Columbus then also wrote that he had found an other world, which he claimed was unknown to either the ancients or Marco Polo. Yet he still believed that this continent belonged to Asia. He wrote, "I believe that this is a very great continent, which until today has been unknown, and reason aids me greatly, because of that so great river and the freshwater sea." Then Columbus returned to Hispaniola, where again he found the island worse off. Once there, he also allowed the slave trade to resume, but providing that the victims were genuine prisoners of war. To make matters worse, a group of Spaniards had broken off in rebellion and joined a local leader named Vespucci, who treated these men to an extravagant feast, including mock battles and dances of naked maidens who were waving palm branches. It must have been quite a sight. It probably would have been wise for Columbus to immediately put down this rebellion firmly, to regain control of his colony. But in this case, he let his meeker nature take over, and he decided to make a peace deal with the rebels. In 1499, Ojeda set sail to South America as well on his own expedition. On board of his ship was a Florentine named Amerigo Vespucci, who would later write an account of this voyage, although without naming his captain. Vespucci would also later claim that he made a trip to the American mainland in 1497, predating Columbus's arrival in Venezuela. But given inconsistencies in his story and a lack of evidence, this is commonly viewed as a fabrication. Columbus's biographer Las Casas already suspected that he made up this voyage to make himself the first to discover mainland America. But it was a very successful fraud, for in 1503 he wrote in his Mundus Novus, or the New World, that South America was in fact a new world, which of course became a famous phrase. He wrote, "Once there we determined that the new land was not an island but a continent, something that in fact Columbus had discovered." We continue, "And these regions we may rightly call a new world, because our ancestors had no knowledge of them." Based on this report, the German cartographer Martin Waldseemüller announced the discovery of a quote, "fourth part of the world," which he named America after Amerigo Vespucci. When another rebellion broke out, Columbus finally put it down by force, as was just necessary to bring back order to this new settlement. Yet just at this time, another scout from the Spanish crown came over to check up on the colony. On his arrival, he saw gallows on which were hanging the corpses of 7 rebel Spaniards. And as a result, Columbus was taken back to Spain in chains. He was also removed from his position as governor and was replaced by Nicholas de Ovando, who ironically acted with far greater severity. Columbus definitely made his mistakes, but his successors turned out to be far worse. Back home in Spain, Columbus was released, and then he was immediately allowed to go on another voyage, but he was barred from visiting Hispaniola. The purpose of the fourth voyage was for Columbus to find a passage to India. He first landed on the Bay Islands near Honduras, where he found the first cacao beans, which the natives used as currency. In Nicaragua, Columbus found, quote, "a great palace of wood, covered with canes, and within some tombs, and in one of which was a corpse dried and embalmed, with no bad odor, wrapped in cotton cloth, and over each tomb was a tablet carved with figures of beasts. A very interesting find. In Panama, Columbus established his first mainland settlement, but this settlement was quickly abandoned when it came under attack. Unbeknownst to him, Columbus was here only 60 kilometers away from the Pacific Ocean, which would be discovered only a few years later, in 1513, by Vasco Núñez de Balboa. On his route back, Columbus's ships began to rot, as they were infested with worms, and they also ran short on provisions. One ship, after being damaged by a coral reef, was also continually filling up with water, which they then had to pump out. Unable to keep his ships afloat, Columbus decided to run them ashore on Jamaica. Stranded there, they received food from the natives, but they had no way to rebuild their ships, and with 160 mouths to feed, the natives could not help them indefinitely. The only solution was to send a messenger in a canoe to Hispaniola, but this island was over 500 kilometers away. Not an easy canoe ride. But miraculously, his messenger managed to survive the trip. But shockingly, he was then detained in Hispaniola by Ovando for another 7 months. Eventually, Ovando did send a small ship to Jamaica, but not to save him, but only to spy on Columbus. A very cruel move. But finally the messenger was released, and then arranged their rescue after a year on Jamaica. Columbus then returned to Spain, where he would stay for the remainder of his life. And thus unfolded the 4 great voyages of Columbus to the New World. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you learned a lot. And if you want to know more about these voyages of discovery, both the good and the bad, or many other topics from world history, then read my book, In Search of the Sublime. You can read it completely for free on worldhistorybook.com, or you can buy a physical copy on Amazon. See you next time. Bye bye.